Kia ora, I'm Erin J. Doyle. Welcome to my channel. Today I want to tell you a little bit about one of my as yet unwritten ideas, and I want to talk about it because it's really on my mind to the point where it might be the story that I pick up when I finish editing my current Camino story. It is a multiverse story, and it's becoming increasingly complicated. Originally, it wasn't even a multiverse story. What I had was a story that was going to be a nice little standalone adventure, and there was time travel. And then I had a completely different story, nice and standalone, in which there was time travel. And the way the time travel worked in these two completely independent stories was different. In one, if you went back in time, you changed the future and you would return to a different and completely changed world. In the other, you couldn't change the future, you'd just create an alternative timeline. And that was fine. I mean, a little bit weird from the same author, but fine. But the more I started developing these ideas, the more I realized that there are actually some similarities between certain elements of the story, and I realized that these two stories actually worked really well together, like they could be a duology, except that the treatment of time travel was different in the two, which is obviously a massive inconsistency. So I spent ages, like I think I've been pondering this for about 2 years now, ages, thinking about how I could fix it and make them work together somehow, or you know, could I change one of the two time travel outcomes so that it was consistent with the other one? I don't know what this is. Maybe I should sit on my hands like a small child. And I came up with something that I liked. What I came up with was a multiverse. And then I had this idea that is silly, but I loved it. What I thought I would do is write all the books I intend to write as their little standalone selves, but bury an Easter egg in every single one of them that a person who had read the one multiverse book would recognize, that told them that actually all of these other completely unrelated standalone books were part of the multiverse I had created. And it was going to be subtle enough that if you just read one of those books, you would not need to read anything else. It would still work as a standalone. You wouldn't notice anything and think, what the hell is that? You would only pick it up if you knew about the multiverse book and had read it. It was like I had it planned, I had it all settled. I even entered it into my planning book. So where is it? At the back. It's at the back. I had like a map of the multiverse. Well, a representation of a map, because I'm not a drawer of maps, I'm a diagram maker. So a diagram of the multiverse so that I could put the correct Easter egg in the correct book. This was so much overthinking. This was not necessary. I was aware it was overkill. But as I was working on this diagram and trying to figure out which Easter egg went in which book, I started thinking, well, hang on a second, if this story, which at the moment is like a premise and nothing else, or is a premise and kind of a vague outline-ish, but full of plot holes and I can't fix them because of this difficulty, if this story is secretly in a multiverse, and the rules of the multiverse apply, then that would solve this giant plot hole. And this kept happening. Some of my sort of most difficult to plan out, confusing story ideas. Stories where I was like, you know, here is a setting for some reason, and the people who live there are doing the thing because of stuff. Suddenly, the multiverse was the answer. The events of the multiverse book explained the thing and the stuff and the bits and pieces that obviously I'm not going to go into because spoilers of doom. But it meant that in deciding that all of these stories, which are standalone, were secretly not standalone, I was able to fill in all these plot gaps. Which means, suddenly, I don't have any standalone books at all. I have this massive, massive pile of stories that are all secretly part of the same series. That's not necessarily a huge deal, like I've said probably several times now. Most of these books are not reliant on the other books. Like, I would still be writing them to be read as individual pieces. There wouldn't be a specific order. You wouldn't read a book and be like, oh, what the hell's going on, because you hadn't read this other one. Which is all very well and good. But it got me thinking about how many stories are actually in my little notebook of stories yet to be written. So I counted them up. And I thought, oh no, that number's too high. I must have done the maths wrong. And then I counted them again. And I thought, shit. If I write one of these stories from whatever state it is currently in through to completely finished, off to the publisher, done, every single year, I will not complete this notebook until I am 86. Like, I actually have more ideas here than I have life left to write them. I mean, I'm not saying that I'll die at 86, but I don't write a book a year. I'm not going to be able to write all of these in my lifetime. And weirdly, I'm okay with that. I don't know why. Possibly it's that realization that I'll get better over time and theoretically I could become faster. Maybe it's the awareness that some of these are possibly, whilst they're ideas that I've written down, they're probably not good enough to ever be written. I probably won't write all of them, just because not all of them are worth writing, rather than just because I run out of life. But I wanted some figures to back that up, so to a spreadsheet I had to go. The spreadsheet. I made a column for story. So each story gets an entry. A story doesn't necessarily mean a book, because it might be that I have multiple characters and each character gets a story, but it's part of the series and I don't know exactly which characters will be in which book, but maybe I know 2 to 3 characters' stories will be in one book. So in the putting it into my journal stage, I just went, you know what, each character's story gets a page. So I've put all those stories in as individual entries, but then in the next column I have book. So here I've specified which book that story goes into. So in theory, there should be fewer books than there are stories. And then, seeing I was spreadsheeting, I decided to collect some additional data. So I have a column for the genre. Here I've been really broad in my definition of each genre. I haven't gone into any kind of subgenres or categories. I've just gone, you know what, magic, it's fantasy. It doesn't matter if it's urban fantasy, this, that or the other thing. obviously I just completely forgot all other types of fantasy subgenre. Fantasy is fantasy, done. Sorry about the car alarm. I needed to do this partly to save time and reduce categories for the purposes of easier analysis. Stupid science brain. But also because some of these stories are very much like a premise and maybe a snippet of dialogue, or a character description or a setting, but I don't really know much more about it. So pinning down the genre was actually pretty hard for some of them, so I've kept this as a very broad genre definition. But oh, that annoyed me because of the lack of resolution. Again, the car alarm. Anyway, so then I created a column for additional descriptors that I might use if I was going to describe or market this book. So this is where I might put in, yes, it's a fantasy, that's the genre, but maybe it's found family or superheroes. It's a fantasy, but it's also a mystery, that kind of thing. So these weren't necessarily all subgenres, they might have been tropes or other features that I would want to bring in if I was selling the book. And then I decided to record which stories were about vampires because I knew I was working on a big vampire epic and I wanted to know how many vampire stories I had. And similarly, I wanted to know about the multiverse thing. So initially I just wanted to know how many multiverse stories I had, but then I decided to make it improved by multiverse. So I've counted ones which are not only dependent on the multiverse, but also which were improved or fixed, made better in some way, if that story existed within the multiverse framework, as I blah-blahed previously, hopefully coherently. Then I decided to keep track of how many stories I had that used fire magic, because I had an inkling that I had multiple stories that used fire magic, but that I hadn't developed those stories very much because I didn't want multiple very similar stories, or rather multiple very different stories, but all with the main character with some kind of fire-based magic, particularly if that magic wasn't at all the same. It felt like, here is an author who's run out of ideas, where realistically it's probably just here is an author who's a bit of a pyro. So I thought I'm going to see how many fire stories I actually have and make some decisions once I have a figure. Whether that means I pick the best one, develop that and just throw away the rest, or because it's a multiverse now, there is another solution's the word I wanted. Maybe instead of having 3 100% independent books where there is a person with fire magic experiencing this, that or the other thing, and then fire magic working in one way or another, maybe I actually have multiple stories in one book with the same people in each different universe, and the fire magic develops differently in each of the different universes. So it's actually the same cast of characters having slightly different magic and therefore different adventures. I don't know. I haven't developed these stories enough to actually know, but I wanted to know how many fire magic stories I was dealing with so I could kind of think about these things. And then, seeing I was on a spreadsheet roll, I decided to add a column for, was it based on a dream? I knew some of the entries were based on dreams that I had, and I just, out of curiosity, I wanted to know how many. And then finally I have a column for progress. So I have given each story a value between 0 and 8, which indicates how far through the writing process I am. So most of these are a 1 or a 0 for it's just a premise really, or yeah, I've got a mind map but nothing else. And then we go through to 8, which would be completely published. I don't have an 8, but I thought I'd put it in there for the future. So this gives me an idea of not just how many stories I have, but how many I have yet to write. So This is where I got 52 stories. 52. Those 52 stories get clumped together into 58 books, one of which is a children's picture book I will probably never write because I have no idea how. So 47 novels, or at least novel type manuscripts. I've allowed things like autobiography to remain under that novel umbrella because we're just counting numbers of books here, it doesn't really matter. Anyway, so 47 novels, 19 of which I have titles for, which I quite like. That doesn't mean they're set in stone, it just means that they're titles I currently really like for them. These 52 stories fall into 10 genres. I have contemporary fiction, creative non-fiction, fantasy, horror, non-fiction, sci-fi, speculative, thriller, and unknown. Unknown because sometimes if it's just a premise, I don't even know if it's sci-fi, fantasy, or what at this point, so I was just like, you know what, it's a story, it gets an entry, but I don't even know what kind. So, unknown. And then for additional descriptors, subgenres, that kind of thing, I also had apocalyptic biography, children's picture book, found family, mermaids, mystery, New Zealand history, prehistoric, romance, romantic comedy, superheroes, time travel, urban fantasy, and zombies. That list of genres and other categories is a little intimidating because how on earth do you market someone whose writing is all over the place like that? It's going to make it really hard to get the right readers for the right book. Like if The Camino Story is the first book to come out and that's contemporary fiction, the next book being high fantasy might kind of upset a few readers, you know. So that's why potentially I could take the pen name route, but I'll link a video where I talk about my previous experience with thinking about fiddling with my publishing name. I've talked about it before, moving on. So, then we have the number of vampire books. So this is, sorry, vampire stories. Of the 52 stories, there are 13 about vampires. I think this actually equates to about 8 books, give or take. Then we've got Multiverse, or improved by being included in a multiverse framework, even if it's not strictly about a multiverse, 7 of the 52. Fire magic, only 3. I was really surprised, I actually thought it was more than that. This is intriguing because it makes that idea of maybe instead of having 3 separate books, having one book with 3 universes suddenly becomes an option. That might be too hard to execute, but we're thinking about it. And then just for curiosity's sake, I counted the ones which were based on dreams, and there were 8 of them, which was much more than I actually thought. I have no idea what that means, it's just an interesting number to come up with. And then we get to the progress. And this is where the fact that there are 52 stories, or 48 books, becomes a bit scary, because the mean progress is less than 1. That means that on average, I barely even have a premise for most of these books. However, I thought I'd break that down a bit more because a progress of 0.9 was a little bit scary, so I looked at the stories which I just have a premise for. It's 16, which I think out of 52, I mean, yes, that's significant, but it's not like, you know, half. It's not a, oh well, why am I even bothering kind of number. And then on top of that I have 19, which I have developed to some degree. Like, I have a robust mind map, perhaps I've started actually writing out a scene by scene plan. 19. I mean, that seems pretty good to have like 19 stories which are planned out and detailed enough to actually progress on to writing or further development. That seems like a pretty decent number. And then we get into some low numbers again. So I have 2 really rough drafts, like 0 draft rough drafts. These are the first book of my vampire series, which I now would reclassify as probably the 5th book because I've done a big shuffle around with that series. I can't remember how much I've talked about that. If I can find a video where I've talked about it, I'll link. But there has been a big shuffle around, not really surprising given how long ago I started working on it. So that's fine. Understandable that that's a really rough draft. The other one is the story from 2020's NaNoWriMo where I did the fairy tale reimagining. Again, it's a NaNoWriMo draft, so pretty rough. But still, 2 completely need to be redone, 0 drafts. That's not a bad thing to have in your back pocket. And lastly we have the 1 completed draft. This is my Camino story, which at the moment is somewhere between the developmental edits and the line edits. I thought I had done all my developmental edits. I thought I was onto line edits and making progress, but the more I got through the line edits, the more I started noticing bigger developmental type edits that needed to be done, like, you know, I'd be tidying up a sentence and be thinking, you know, actually I should have mentioned this earlier, or this would actually be a good place to expand on blah blah blah. So I'm kind of dancing somewhere between those 2 types of editing, but nonetheless I'm up to editing, but I still consider it a completed draft because you could totally print this off, sit down and read it beginning to end and 100% know the story, but it's maybe not as well written or as rich as it could be with a bit more work. So I'm calling it a completed draft, but not like final draft. I think that makes sense. So all of this is to say I have 47 novels to write. I'm 38. I have to live forever. Wish me luck, I guess, and I'll let you know how I go. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time, possibly with fewer numbers. Bye.